Okay. Thank you, Mariska. And thank you, Ibra. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all. And I really admire this series and I've been able to watch some of the, participate in some of the presentations, and I'm just proud to be part of it. So as Mariska said, my topic today is basically the paper, the 2017 article that Mike Pfarrer and I wrote as a letter from the editor in the Academy Management Review, where we talked about basically what we call the building blocks of a theory paper. But I want to get into this a little bit more and talk about how these ideas are transferable to other papers as well. So I think the audience today is pretty wide, but I'm imagining that a lot of you are beginning and interested in learning these building blocks so that you can create good habits and kind of learn some tricks of the trade. And others of you might be more established and maybe just want to confirm some things you already know. And others of you might be people who are mentoring or teaching others. And I do believe that this framework is helpful in that regard as well. So wherever you are, I hope you find this at least somewhat helpful. And if there are clarification questions as I proceed, it would be great if you raised your hand, and so that we could hear the question. If there are bigger questions that you'd like to talk about, well, I'm going to leave some time at the end when we can have more of a Q&A. And so that's my plan for today. You'll see I'm not using PowerPoint slides because I'm just going to try something different. And I feel like PowerPoint can be both an enabler and a constrainer. So I'm going to try using more of a whiteboard and see if I can create a cogent presentation without pre-prepared slides. Okay, so let's see if that works. And I should say that I first started thinking about the structure that I'm going to talk about today when I was a doctoral student, and early on, and Professor Matt Hayward came into one of our classes to talk about his approach to writing. And it made a big impression on me. And he was talking about this book by Barbara Minto called The Pyramid Principle. And it is not about academic writing, but it's about structured writing, logic in writing and thinking, as the subtitle says. And Matt was talking to us students about how he used the ideas in this book to think about how he structures his own writing. And that made a big impression on me. So it is, in fact, the basis for what we came up with. And I want to emphasize now, and maybe a couple times during this presentation, that the ideas that I'm going to give you today are not things that Mike and I came up with. These are not brand new ideas. Basically what we tried to do is distill and package in a very accessible form the ideas that we had learned from others. And some of those others I'll talk about today. And anyway, I just don't want to make any claims to innovation here. It was our idea to call them the 5 C's, and the reason is we wanted them to be memorable and accessible for you. So that's why we did that. So just a couple of points that I wanted to make. Well, let's do this one. That I told you we wrote this in AMR, but this is not just for theory papers. We wrote it as a letter from the editor in the Academy of Management Review, which, as you know, is a theory-only journal, and we talked about it in terms of the 5 building blocks for writing a theory paper. But you might notice that any good empirical paper has a strong theoretical buildup in the front end. And this is where this exact same framework comes in very handy. So, and then the other point I wanted to make, just as an introduction, is that it's not just for writing. So what I mean is that, and I'm going to talk about this more, but this structure is a good structure for idea finding. It's a good structure for thinking about your presentations. A lot of what we do as academics is give presentations. So how you're designing your presentation, these 5 C's will be very helpful in that regard as well. I find it helpful in reviewing other work when I'm reviewing for conferences or when I'm reviewing for journal review. It helps me take a structured look at how other people are presenting their ideas. And then if you are, I'm going to take a break. It is early here in the desert southwest of the US. I don't know where you are in the world right now, but our sun just came up, so I'm going to have a cup of coffee. Yeah, if you are in fact a pretty new doctoral student, you might be doing a lot of reading and trying to remember and trying to sort of understand literatures. And I think, and I'm going to talk about this later as well, but I think that this structure is a good one for approaching a new article and trying to understand the basic points that the article is trying to get across, and even for taking notes. So I think for a new scholar, it's a good structure for reading and remembering. All right, so that's kind of what I think this is useful for. So I probably should tell you then what it's all about. And underlying this framework is a central metaphor. And the metaphor is a conversation. So, as I said, these are new ideas, and we borrowed this idea heavily from the great Huff, and this work in particular, which you should get a hold of, her book called Writing for Scholarly Publication. And she wants you to think about joining an academic, writing for academic audiences as joining a conversation. And she encourages you to really think about that in a literal way, to sort of put the papers of the people that you're trying to join the conversation with on your desktop right in front of you, so that it feels like you're joining a conversation. Well, Mike and I took that one step further, and we want you to envision actually walking into a conference room where the authors are sitting around a table, the authors of the particular conversation that you want to join. And so we think that this metaphor is useful for a couple of reasons. And one is that it reminds us that the people that we're interacting with, and you are interacting with them, are humans. And this is something you kind of learn as you get deeper into the career, that there's actually people involved in there's actual human beings who wrote these articles, and you'll get to know them. You'll run into the conferences, some of them will become your friends, some of them will become your collaborators. And I have to say, it feels sometimes easy to forget, for example, when you're doing an anonymous review for a journal, that there's actually a human being on the other end of that who put maybe a year or two of work into that paper that you're going to take, I don't know, a day or half a day to criticize. And it's good to be thinking about these people as as other living, breathing human beings with feelings. So that's one thing that I think it's good to remember, and that they'll be reacting to you, that they should be reacting to you the same way. Another thing that I think this metaphor helps remind us of is that we are involved in a knowledge creation enterprise, and that when you are at the level you're at now, you're no longer thinking about just being a consumer of other people's knowledge, but that you are actually thinking about yourself as joining this discussion, joining this table, walking in the conference room and becoming part of the discussion and part of a process. So again, you're not just consuming, but you're part of the process of knowledge creation. And I guess one other thing that the metaphor helps, I think, me focus on is that if you think about it as a conversation, well, then you want to understand what the nature of that conversation is. And what I mean is that an academic conversation can have so many different facets to it, and you can't look at this in a superficial way if you're really going to figure out how you're going to join that conversation. And so obviously the subject matter of the conversation is important, whether it's an empirical or a conceptual discussion that's going on. The tone of the conversation, maybe it's a heated discussion, maybe it's cordial, maybe somebody's getting slapped. Is there divergence in the room, in what's being talked about? One way of thinking about it is there could actually be more than one discussion going on in the room. There could be people talking in subgroups to each other and not even understanding or talking past each other. So there's just a whole lot that you can, just as you would if you were literally walking into a conference room and listening to people discussing, you can start gathering these clues about the nature of the discussion so quickly. So that, well, and I guess we should also say that you could also understand what values are being expressed in the discussion, given that science and social science, by its very nature, is value laden, and the people in the discussion will be expressing different values. You can also get an understanding of what the life cycle, where you are in the life cycle. Let's put it this way: where the discussion is in the life cycle of a particular area of subject matter, and understanding that subjects have life cycles, and it could be early on in the emergence of this subject matter. It could be a very mature subject matter. It could be a subject matter that the conversation is trying to revive from the past and apply it either to new theory, new empirics. So that would be something else that you could understand. Yeah. So when you think about, I guess another value of thinking about this as a metaphor would be that you're thinking about yourself in terms of actually joining that conversation. So you're understanding the nature of the conversation, but now you're thinking about, what would it mean for me to join it? How might I join the conversation? And really, this is where the model, the framework that I'm going to talk about today is all about. It's about how.
Can I quickly interrupt?
Yeah, please.
It looks like the presentation of this program, it's off kilter a little bit. If you could center the image.
So joining should be in the middle.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's going to move around. I'm sorry. That's just the
Okay.
nature of it. But the whiteboard will move around, and what's in the center is what I'm trying to talk about.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, apologies for it. And I'm just kind of getting used to figuring out how to use this as well, so it may not be perfect. But anyway, yeah, so joining the conversation. Joining that conversation is what this 5 C's framework is all about. And I'm going to get into each of these C's, but they are, just to introduce them quickly, it's finding common ground with the people in the discussion. It's understanding that there might be a complication to that common ground, figuring out what the puzzle is in the conversation, what people aren't addressing correctly, why that's important, what the concern is, and then what you're going to do about it, which is the course of action. And finally, how that's a contribution. So I'll talk about each of those, but that is, that's what I'm going to talk about today. So that's the central metaphor. And the joining the conversation, and the 5 C's are about how to do so in a way that will be useful and successful. I think a question that we could ask next would be then, what conversation to join? Understanding that if we go with this metaphor, and if academics and scholarship and social science and business and management research are these conversations that are going on in thousands of conference rooms, and you'd have to decide which door to open and which conference room to join, then, well, let's do this. So, okay, I think, let me see if I can add text to this. Yeah, that didn't work. Okay. So obviously you want it to be something that's interesting to you. And early on in your career, that may be not as much of an option as it will be later in your career. Earlier in your career, you might be needing to work with the people who are mentoring you and tagging along with what's most interesting to them. But ideally, what you work on should be intensely interesting to you, because when you get into the hard work of doing research, having it be something that's compelling to you will help you get over the difficulties and the struggles. I would suggest to you that you also want it to be something that's valuable in the real world. And I think this might be one way that what the RRBM, the research, the Responsible Research in Business and Management movement is all about. It's understanding that the value of values-driven research, and really 2 values-based ideas that RRBM is very interested in is scientific rigor and social relevance. So this little roadmap could be a nice way of deciding what conversation you want to join. Not just interesting, but also something that people are going to find valuable, and that's has the potential to be socially relevant and scientifically rigorous. Just as an example from my own work, in what conversation I decided to join recently, there was, and I think what I'm going to recommend to you is that you consider phenomenon as a good way of finding things that are interesting to you and valuable in the real world. An example from my own work is in 2016, I guess. There was, I'm just following the news, and it turns out the Carrier Corporation in Indianapolis, Indiana, in the US, it's a big corporation that makes furnaces and air conditioners. And the Carrier Corporation announced that they were going to close 2 factories in Indianapolis, Indiana, and move them to Monterrey, Mexico. And that seemed like kind of typical business decision in our current world, but this became a very heated conversation in the US. And it even became part of the presidential campaign, and an essential feature early on of then candidate Donald Trump's campaign, that it wasn't right that Carrier was closing these US factories, and meaning that US workers would lose their jobs. I found that very interesting. So it was 1,400 jobs that were moving to Mexico. And I just found that very interesting because it was an example of what traditionally, at least in the US, has been pretty much a business decision. And it suddenly becomes a very fraught political and public policy debate. And I started thinking about how interesting it is that different stakeholders within this pressuring the same firm have very different interests and are not necessarily looking out for each other's interests. So that was the seed of an idea to me that I found intensely interesting and valuable. And if I have time, I'm going to sort of talk about how I approach that later on. But it's the discussion that I wanted to join. I had an interest in the stakeholder view of the firm and stakeholder relationships. And so reading about this incident in the news led me to think that that's a conversation that I want to explore further. Okay, so I will get back to that if I can. But my conversation right now gets to, I think, the challenge of idea finding. And idea finding, well, it kind of becomes our central challenge as researchers, and it feels especially challenging when you are a brand new scholar, a new researcher just learning, because it starts to feel like everything's been done already. When you read these really interesting journal articles and the research that people have done, and you're thinking, how can I possibly find an idea? And I feel like, I don't know what you feel like, but sometimes it's, sometimes, oops, didn't do that exactly the way I wanted to. So let me do this the right way. So this is what I had in mind, that I found myself sometimes just staring at the blank screen with my cup of coffee next to me and the cursor blinking at me and thinking, okay, I have to come up with an idea. And my suggestion to you is that that is sometimes fruitful, but I think a better way, and if we draw on this idea of the conference room metaphor, and we go back to Ann Huff's idea of like laying out the papers in front of you that you're interested in, then you have a very different approach to idea finding, which is, it looks something like this. You just dig into literatures. Maybe you start off with a phenomenon that's of interest to you, but you you're digging in and you're seeing what people have said, and you're understanding what the nature of the conversation is. And again, that means, let me go back, that means that you're trying to understand what the subject matter is, what the empirical, conceptual, what the tone is, what the divergences of discussion are, what values are being reflected, what the life cycle is of the particular idea. You're thinking about it in terms of a phenomena that's interesting to you. And all of this before you actually settle in on the particular idea you want to study. What I'm suggesting to you is that there isn't really a shortcut to idea finding. You really have to immerse yourself into the literature. And maybe, I guess maybe the only shortcut that's available to you is you could say, well, I can do firsthand, I can dig into this research firsthand and become an expert in myself. Or if you're on a research team, you might bring in an expert in an area, and you might call that, George Huber wrote his great review of learning, organizational learning in organization science in 1991. And I think he pretty much introduced this idea that you can graft knowledge onto your organization. For example, by bringing in employees from another firm who already know how to do something. Well, I think you can use that same idea for research teams and say, if we really need expertise in an area, then let's bring somebody in who knows it. But so that might be a way of, in a research team, of adding on that kind of depth of knowledge that you need. But as a new scholar, really, you need to become a firsthand expert in an area before you can really understand where the idea lies. So, yeah. So let's return to the central metaphor then, which is the conversation. And conversation, we're going to make the conversation the context. And I like to start off, well, that didn't look so good, but okay, I want to start off with this idea from Murray Davis. This is an article that may be familiar to you. It's his famous article called That's Interesting in 1971. We use this quote in our article and build on it because Murray Davis says that all social theories which are found interesting involve a certain movement of the mind of the audience who finds them so. And if you combine that with the idea that conversation is the context, then our point is that you must know where the mind of your audience is, what the starting place is, in order for you to figure out where you're going to be moving the mind to. So this is how I'm going to envision it. I'm going to say you need to figure out where the audience is, and this is going to be our first C in the 5 C's model. So yeah, let's do this. Okay, common ground. I think I can make this look better now. So I'm going to do this. Common ground. Put this like this. Didn't work so good. Let me try one more time. Sorry, as I get used to this. Okay, that's what I wanted. Now, and move this over here. And here we have our first C. Again, the idea is, and building on Murray Davis's idea, that we need to know where the mind of the audience is before we can even think about trying to move it. And again, this is you now being an expert in the conversation, really understanding the conversation. And now you're going to be, as the we're thinking about now structuring, like, for example, an introduction to a paper. And you want to be a guide to your reader as to what the nature of the discussion is. The common ground we're talking about is you establishing common ground with your reader and with the conference room participants, so that everybody agrees with your starting point. And in order to do that, I've got some suggestions for you. You want to make your discussion very relevant to, in other words, you want the people who are reading it to think, well, yeah, this actually pertains to the topic that we're talking about. Sometimes people will ask me, or students will ask me, like, how much should I put in a literature review? And I think relevance becomes very important here, because you want to include what I always say, you need to include what you need to include, but don't include anything more. So you need to include what people have to see to understand the nature of the conversation. But if you go beyond what's needed, then it starts to feel like a chapter of a dissertation, where you're just information dumping, and it's not relevant to what you need to do in this particular enterprise, this particular project. So you want to make it very relevant, and include what needs to be included. So don't leave things out. You also want it to feel somewhat familiar to the audience that you're writing to. And the way I would describe that is you want it to feel accurate. So you want to strive for a high level of accuracy. You also want efficiency, meaning, again, that you don't want to include extra stuff that shouldn't be in there, but you also want it to feel complete. The goal then is, because you've got two audiences that you should be keeping in mind while you're writing. And one of them is the people who are already at the table, the people who are already in this discussion. And why are they an important audience? Well, partly because you're trying to join that conversation, but also just as a very practical matter, it's very likely they're going to be a reviewer. Well, at least one of those people is going to be, and probably more, is going to be one of the reviewers. If you're submitting to a top journal, one of those people will be one of your reviewers. And so in this common ground idea, what you want is that those people will be nodding in agreement. They'll be saying, okay, yeah, you get it. And just imagine if you are at the table and this new person comes to the table and starts trying to explain what the conversation is going on, and they're missing parts of it, or they're misrepresenting it, or they're presented in a stylized way that tries to get to a particular point but is actually inaccurate. This would be very irritating to you. And it will explain to you the reactions that some reviewers give you when they seem kind of angry. This is one way to make a reviewer angry, is to be inaccurate or inefficient or incomplete in your in establishing this common ground. Of course, your other audience in this common ground isn't the people at the table, but the people you're introducing to the table. So this would be the general reader, the person who's not an expert in this area. And so for them, you want those readers to feel like, okay, you're trustworthy. You're a trustworthy guide to the literature, reliable. And again, you want them to feel you're accurate, efficient, and complete. So either of those audiences, basically, you can get to the end you're looking for by by trying to be accurate, efficient, and complete. So yeah, and so that's the first C, that common ground, getting everybody nodding, getting everybody think, okay, you're a reliable guide, you kind of understand where the starting point. But then once you've established that common ground, you're ready to point out the limitations of that common ground. And of course, this is where things get interesting in research, because this is the complication C in research. And if we go back to that metaphor again, and we think about the conference room, then what you're trying to do is you're trying to get those people who are sitting at the table to actually turn to you and pay attention to you. And these are people who have spent a lot of time thinking about what you're trying to enter the room and talk about. And so how do you get their attention in a way that they're going to continue listening to you? Our suggestion is that you want to find something about the conversation, something about the common ground that is a limitation to the discussion. And so you want those heads turning. How do you do so? Introduce a problem in the conversation, or a puzzle, or a twist. And this is another area where obviously this is not Mike and my idea, but a lot of people have talked about this, and one of them is in fact Murray Davis, who I talked about before. So Murray Davis, in that same article, that's interesting. He talked about the importance of challenging the assumptions. He called it challenging the assumption base of your audience. Others who have talked about this, and a lot of people have talked about it, Locke and Golden Bidwell. Okay, I'll get that to work better. Let's try it again. Locke and Golden Bidwell in this article in AMJ, they've talked about it. You're going to hear this term a lot, but they called it problematizing literature. And let's see, Grant and Pollock from the editor letter in the Academy of Management Journal. Well, they said, yeah, you need to challenge assumptions. But, and it won't be inspiring if your challenges are too tentative. So they encourage you to challenge the assumptions in a bold way, but they also caution you not to be too bold, because if you approach this with a scorched earth approach, where you try to completely overturn the assumptions of your audience, well, then it's likely that your audience is going to find you to be irrelevant or absurd. And so there's this happy medium between novelty and incrementalism. You want to pique interest, but you don't want to, but you want to add to rather than overturn people's assumption base. So, yeah. That's complication. And then, of course, once you identify, it gets even trickier now, because once you identify this complication of like, what is it about the discussion that is problematic, that isn't going right? Maybe you realize, maybe when you enter that conference room, you realize that there's two discussions going on and they are not talking to each other. Or maybe you actually are remembering the discussion from another conference room that's very relevant to this one, but they don't know about that conversation. And so it's another way of saying there's a complication to this conversation. But whatever that puzzle, problem, or twist that you find is, the next step is to point out to your readers or to your audience why it's of concern. And that's our third C. So now just refresh again, we've got common ground, complication, and now we're at concern. And concern is basically explaining why anybody should care. So it really isn't enough to find a problem or a twist or a puzzle. You need to find, really, let me say this, you need to have a compelling complication's importance. You need to have a compelling explanation for the complication's importance. And I would suggest to you that of all the C's, this is probably where papers are most likely to die, because don't forget now, your reviewers are likely to be very sophisticated members of the conversation, the people at the table. And you're going to come in as a newbie and you're going to say, hey, here's something you guys are getting wrong or missing or part of the discussion that you're ignoring. And it's going to be a high hurdle because inconsistencies and contradictions and missing pieces, they're often easy to find. And I would suggest to you that often they're easy to identify. The problem is that if you haven't made the case that the inconsistency or contradiction or missing piece that you've identified is in fact important, your audience, your sophisticated audience, may judge them as trivial or your attention to them as pedantic or needless. And that, of course, is the big danger. It isn't a, well, let me give you this picture because this is from my home state, Wisconsin. Yeah, this is you say, but I found a gap. I found a gap in the literature. And we're not the first one to point out that simply finding a gap in the literature will be insufficient to convince people that you have found a concern that needs to be addressed. People will often say to you, you know, there's a reason that there hasn't been attention paid to that because it doesn't matter. It's trivial. And so just finding something that people haven't paid attention to or that there's a gap in the literature is not sufficient. And maybe if we go back to, I've been talking about writing now for a while, but let's go back to the idea of idea finding. And you think about now the relationship between these three C's, common ground, complication, and concern, when you're considering idea finding. As you're finding and refining your ideas, you should be testing them against, really the idea then would be the complication that you found. But then if you're not able to marshal your arguments for why people should care about it, why it's an important concern, well, you may need to go back to the drawing board. And that may mean that you need to dig further into the literature and figure out more about what the conversation is. So in the beginning stages of idea finding, these three C's become iterative and going back and forth between them or among them. It can be necessary. It's not always the case, and maybe rarely the case when the first idea that you come up with satisfies is such an interesting complication and is very important that that you can just go with it without revisiting the complication, revisiting the literature, and refining your idea. So once you have these 3 C's laid out, then sorry about that. Once you have these three, let me get rid of that. Once you have these three C's laid out, then you've set the stage for what really is the heart of your project. And that is our 4th C, which is the course of action. What are you going to do about it? Let me try that one more time. Somebody else get good at this. There it is. So your course of action, as I say, it's really what your project is all about. It's the solution that you're providing. So when you're writing this up, again, you need to make sure that when you're explaining your course of action, you are explaining how it is highly relevant to, guess what, the complication. And if you are going outside of the complication, if all of a sudden you're addressing a complication that you didn't introduce earlier, which people often do, then your readers are going to be confused, and your sophisticated readers are going to be a little irritated with you because you haven't told you. It's going to look like you've come up with, it's going to look like you have a solution, searching for a problem. And a reviewer might even tell you that. They'll say, it looks like you have a good solution, but you don't have a problem. And so you want your course of action to be very relevant to your complication. And you want your course of action to feel convincing. How do you do that? Well, obviously with tight logic. And also, you want it to be well explained. So you want your writing to be clear. By the way, yeah, thinking about, I mean, well explained obviously applies to not just this C, but to the other C's as well. And one idea that I think is important for all of us to think about is how poorly we explain things a lot of times in academic writing. As somebody who's thought about this a lot is Steven Pinker, the psychologist at Harvard University. And I really like and recommend this book that he wrote about writing, The Sense of Style. Just one idea that I want to take from this book right now to mention to you is the idea of the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge. He has a chapter on it. It's not something that he invented. In fact, it comes out of research. Just let me just tell you. So the curse of knowledge is the idea that you think what's in your head is well understood by other people, and you overestimate the degree to which other people understand what you understand. And so there's been some simple and clever experiments that show how this works. One of which is you have a group of people sitting in a room, and you ask one person to tap out a song, a very popular song that everybody will know. Tap it out, the rhythm of it. Just tap it out, and then they ask the person who tapped it out to estimate how many people in the room will understand what song they tapped out. And I don't know, I don't recall from the study what the exact percentages are, but people always way overestimate how many people will understand what song they just tapped out. Way overestimated. And Steven Pinker says this is the exact same thing that happens in academic writing, that because we think that people understand what's going on in our heads, that they have a similar knowledge base to us, that we under-explain things, that we overestimate how much they understand. And so this is his explanation for how smart people, highly educated people, can be so bad at writing because of this idea of the curse of knowledge. So that should be something that you think about in terms of all the C's, whether or not you're explaining things well. Okay, so then these 4 C's then, common ground, complication, concern, and course of action, of course, set the stage for the final C, which is, contribution. And this is your chance to make the case that you have actually, let me try that again, that you have actually influenced the conversation. So if you go back to that metaphor of the conference room, it's your chance to make the case that the path of the discussion is now different from the way it was before. And so your task here in this C is to make the case that your work has shaped or changed the conversation in some important way. That could be that you're changing how prior work is used or interpreted, or you're changing you're changing the actual trajectory of future work. We should be cautioned, though, because what you want to avoid over claiming. So you want to avoid, what marketers might call puffery or exaggeration, because those will undermine your credibility. And if you are exaggerating in any of the C's, you will undermine your credibility, and credibility is what you're trying to establish in all 4 of these C's. Establishing your contribution is also challenging, obviously, because you're fighting against hindsight bias. If you are a really good explainer, the paradox that you confront is that after people read your great explanation, they will think that they knew it already, or that it was obvious. And this is just the common hindsight bias that humans have, that this idea that when they hear something, oh, I knew that all along. So it's going to, when you explain your contribution, it's really up to you to explain how you brought them to this new place. Okay, now, those are the 5 C's. And
we have an interesting question in the chat.
Good.
Okay. Kevin, if you're able, just jump on in, or I'm happy to read it.
Hi, yes. So my question, Don, is this idea of being explicit in your writing, so to avoid the curse of knowledge, so not assuming that the audience can read your mind, which makes a lot of sense. But then there's also kind of counterbalance to that of being too pedantic or patronizing in your writing. I'm curious how you kind of balance those.
My experience is that if you're going to lean one way or the other, it's better to lean toward a high level of clarity. And I hardly ever get criticized for making things too clear.
Looks like Don froze.
Naive or unsophisticated level. And I think that's a danger, but I guess my thought is that we have a tendency to try to sound smarter than well, no, I'm going to say everybody's smart here. So the question is, like, are you feeling a little insecurity about that? But sometimes I feel a little insecurity about that. And so I'll maybe think I need to be a little bit more opaque in my writing to kind of prove that this is really smart stuff. But I fight against that, and I tend to be rewarded by having a high level of clarity. So it's not Kevin, it's not a perfect answer to your question, but I do recognize there's a trade-off. But I do try to lean toward clarity, and I think that you'll find that the papers that you admire probably have a high level of clarity in their writing. Is there others before we move on? Okay. Now I presented these 5 C's in a very linear way. But I would like to suggest to you that here's my linear. Does one need to follow the 5 C's step by step? And if you read that from the editor letter that Mike and I wrote, we took the second half of the article to look at some papers, award-winning papers in AMR, and look at their introductions and talk about how they did the 5 C's. And one thing we noted in that deconstruction of those papers is that some people played around with the 5 C's and didn't do them linearly. And my suggestion to you is that this is the kind of thing that once you understand the fundamentals, then you can play around with the fundamentals. But as a beginning writer, it makes sense to be linear. And then maybe as you become more sophisticated, you might play around with the techniques. I would still say, one example I always give is the writing of Carl Weick, who has transcended sort of any sort of very simplistic structure and presents his information in an extremely creative way. And I would say even for somebody like Carl Weick, who is more like Picasso at age 90 in the way he presents his information, you can still identify how the 5 C's are evident in his writing. It's just in different ways than in this very linear way. So that's my only suggestion to you. Another thought I had that when I was talking about this iteration, and how even when you're trying to establish the contribution, you may realize that you've got to go back and revisit the other C's, because you're not actually able to talk about how you change the conversation. And so thinking about really having to make the case in each of these 5 C's oftentimes requires you to go back and revisit the other C's and go back and forth. And this is where we come across the problem where we fall in love with our writing. We put, I don't know, a week into writing something, and it just really is great. And it's so hard to go back and realize that you've got to revisit it and rewrite it. But if you talk to some of the most successful writers, and it's just almost without exception, the most successful writers will tell you that they are happy to completely revise something that they've written, and that they will do it repeatedly. And sometimes the 5th version of the paper will look nothing like the 1st version of the paper. And so I think just another little tip for you is be aware of this idea that we fall in love with our own writing, but realize that can be a trap. That as you're doing this iteration between these 5 C's, you may need to revisit. You may need to completely throw out something that you liked pretty well before.
Don, we have a question from Kay that relates to this. Kay, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. My question relates to this pursuit of clarity. And
Yes.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the tone of writing. Many scholarly articles are very dense and difficult to follow, yet the authors are highly regarded, as are their contributions. And, you know, what you were saying earlier about using language that sort of guises your insecurity. But there's this tension between that and writing simply and clearly, and how your work is regarded by your reviewer.
When I was a doctoral student, I heard a presentation by somebody, a linguist, and I'm kind of kicking myself because I can't remember now whether he was talking about a published paper or whether he was talking about some preliminary research. But the idea was that when we're new scholars, and you can look at the writing that when you're a new doctoral student and you look at the writing that people do, it tends to be more opaque, harder, bigger words, more complicated sentences. And then as people proceed in the doctoral program, they loosen up a little bit and their writing becomes a little bit more accessible, a little bit clearer. And then when they get their first job in academia, they start reverting a little bit to that more opaque writing, a little bit longer sentences, bigger words. And then as they, get farther on in a career, they kind of loosen up a little bit and more clarity. And the whole idea behind that, what I took from that presentation was that we're really expressing our insecurities, and we're trying to, we all have this imposter syndrome at some point where you're thinking everybody around here is smarter than I am. And you're just trying to live up to these high expectations on you. And so you're trying to sound as smart as you possibly can. My suggestion is that that isn't going to be the most effective way to communicate your ideas, to get people to read your work, to cite your work. I don't know the empirical evidence on this, but my intuition suggests that that the people who write very densely and very opaquely don't, well, I don't want to go too far down that road, but I think that they're not the people I admire the most. And I want to be the person that other people admire. So I want to be the person who writes in a very accessible way. And I do. And by the way, I think fashion has changed in this regard, because older articles that you pull out will oftentimes be written in a way that you have to read them 5 times to understand what the heck they're talking about. And I think a more modern style is a more accessible style, even with the difference between passive voice and active voice, where the old style was you would never use active voice. It seemed very unscholarly. So you would never say, we studied. You would always say, it has been studied, or something like that. So you'd always use the passive voice. And nowadays, most journal styles want you to use active voice, where you say, I studied, or we found, not rather than it has been found, or that kind of thing. So I think that we're valuing more nowadays clarity more than we did before, and I think that's a good thing. I'm in favor of it. I don't think it detracts from your ability to. In fact, I think what you find is that it's easier to fall into language that's less accessible, and it's harder to achieve this very high level of clarity. Whatever you do, be conscious of it. Don't do what Steven Pinker is talking about, which is that you accidentally are opaque because you're just assuming that everybody knows what you know.
Thank you, Don and Kay. Ibra, you had your hand raised.
On this topic of clarity, whether it's, there's an element of insecurity at play or not, what if you're dealing with, highly abstract concepts and you're trying to explain maybe some sort of connection between them? Let's say, agency and structure, for example. Just being reminded, for example, the paper, what is agency? They deal with these highly abstract concepts, and which makes it for difficult reading. But as I try to write and I'm grappling with this highly abstract concepts. How can we make it clearer? Any views?
I guess, Ibra, this is why I said it can be harder to write with a high level of clarity than to just kind of settle into so taking something like agency, structure, relationship, and trying to explain that in a way that I'm not trying to explain it in a way that like my mother would understand. That's not quite the kind of clarity I'm going for. I'm trying to achieve a level of clarity that a scholar who's not an expert in my area would catch on pretty fast. And so obviously it's going to differ from subject area to subject area, and some complex ideas are highly resistant to this high level of clarity I'm talking about. But I would suggest to you that even the most complex ideas can be expressed more clearly. I mean, you look at like I forget the guy's name on PBS who I watched a special where he's explaining the theory of relativity, which isn't really that accessible of an idea, but does it in such a way that you come away with it thinking, okay, yeah, I understand it. And I think it's not out of our realm of possibility that we can explain things with a higher level of clarity than we would naturally do, that we would just fall into naturally. So I don't know if that's a good answer you brought or not.
Don, I'm just going to check in now that we're getting into writing style. There's a lot of questions starting to come into the chat. Is this a good place to develop that discussion?
Let's do that. Yep.
Okay. Let's see. Dawn, I'm sorry, Katrina, would you like to ask your question?
I would like actually to ask, so how do you approach the revision of your papers when they're rejected and very much criticized? So let's say the reviewer says that your model is too complicated, too specific, and like, I don't understand the arrows going in this or that direction. And basically, then you need to turn to the data and elaborate more on your findings. And so you need to change kind of the whole narrative of your paper then. So how do you approach then in this case? Thank you.
Thanks, Katrina. That's a really important question. And especially when you're starting out, it can feel devastating to get this kind of feedback from reviewers. I try not to overreact to feedback because the reviewers are usually 2 or 3 people who have their own opinions. And if I had 2 or 3 other people, they might have different opinions. So I want to be careful that it's not specific to that review team, the concerns, but I also want to learn from what they told me. And it's hard at first because it feels so personal. And I even hate opening up the reviews when I see it's a rejection, and I put them aside for a while, and I take a while to kind of realize that all that work I put into it now got rejected. And then when I can, I'll open them up, and then I'll make notes to myself about what is actionable. What is it that they suggested that, because usually they're not just criticizing, they're also giving suggestions. And especially at top journals, the reviewers are usually pretty good about giving you some suggestions, even in a harsh rejection. And so I will try to make notes of what they did. I will go back and I will see what parts of the paper it applies to. I mean, and sometimes it's what you might call a fatal flaw, which, like a fatal flaw in my 4Cs model might be where the people who are at the table in the conversation say, I can't believe you missed what a whole part of this conversation that's been going on for the last 10 years. And you are basically duplicating what we've already done, or something like that. That would be a devastating critique, meaning that I had not dug into the literature well enough, or they might say, well, okay, you found a what you call a contribution, but it's trivial. No one cares. And then I might think, okay, so could I make a better, then my choice is, could I make a better case that it isn't trivial? Or could I, or maybe it is trivial and I have to find a new complication. I mean, those are two, those are two possibilities. So it's hard to answer it in a generic way, Katrina. But I do, and the farther you get on in the career, the more you get a little hardened to, you don't feel quite as personal in the rejections. They're not as hard to take, and you do look at them as learning opportunities. And I've been rejected at all the best places many times. Almost always, not always, but almost always, I've been able to learn from the reviews, rework the paper, and find another outlet for it. And I think most people find that to be the case, that even if the first or second journal you get knocked down, then maybe the third journal is going to be successful. And it's just and usually you find that third paper then that is actually better than your original idea, because you were able to use all that harsh feedback you got to make the paper better. So that's my approach, at least.
Thanks a lot. That makes sense. Yeah. And maybe just a short comment on that also, because I have heard that the reviewer usually takes, 40 minutes of the time to go through your paper and to check like if there is something novel in it, some novel contribution. Because if there is, if he doesn't like the story, then he will immediately reject your paper. So it's also the way kind of how you structure your paper and how you make your story interesting to the reviewer, basically.
Yeah, and maybe maybe this gives me a chance to just to point everybody to a little article that I really like, and this was by Jay Barney, in another from the editor letter in the Academy of Management Review. Again, he wrote it for review papers, but I think the advice he gives you really works for empirical papers as well. And what he's suggesting is a very tight introduction to a paper. He's suggesting that your introduction to the paper should have 3 paragraphs, only 3 paragraphs. And that basically the first paragraph would be what Mike and Eric call common ground. He calls it joining the conversation. And then in paragraph 2, he says, maybe start it with the word however. And notice how that's the complication, because he's saying first paragraph, the conversation, second paragraph, however, and then so in the second paragraph, you're saying, however, so you explain the conversation and the concern, why it's important. And then the third paragraph, you're saying, here's the purpose of the paper and what the implications are for theory and for managers. And so, what he's trying to do is make sure that your reader and your reviewer doesn't get exhausted with you, that you made your tight case real well in the beginning, and then you use the rest of the paper, use the body of the paper to expand on each of those things, which by the way is the exact same advice that Mike and I are giving, which is that you have this tight introduction with the 5 C's, but then basically the body of the paper is you then expounding on each of that. The first part of the paper is the literature review, where you're really fleshing out the conversation, the common ground, and then you're really sharpening what you mean by the complication. And then the big part of the body of your paper is, of course, your course of action, what you're actually doing to solve the problem, and then contribution at the end. So I think Jay gives good advice here that everybody should read. You may not want to use the 3-paragraph introduction because it may not feel like you've got enough space to do everything you need to do. But what it causes you to do is say, well, maybe I don't need a 3-page introduction, which a lot of people do. And maybe I could really cut this down. So anyway, that's my idea.
Okay, do you have a question?
Oh, thank you. So like, thank you to like Dr. Lange for this work. This kind of work important and helpful conversation for me. You know, I'm a relatively like fresh academic, got my PhD 1 year, a bit over 1 year ago. You know, has been resonant with what I have been thinking and wondering about, but not in a systematic way like you discussed. So I just wonder whether you know, how you can situate the conversation like about what individual scholars do with a broader like context. You know, we are in the academic field. The field is a market of ideas. You know, so you know, I have sort of a relatively limited experience. You know, I got my PhD maybe 1 year ago. I have reviewed for peer review for about 15 like journals. So my sense is like there is certainly a higher like rejection rate, but in the meantime, like probably I guess editor probably are struggling with publishing good papers. You have been an editor for many years, so it's kind of paradox. You also discussed, for instance, and I have, you know, in my doctoral training or like earlier, I didn't read anything about like what Dr. Huff has written. But after I got my PhD, I do my research. I read her like work. Actually, I admire it. Yeah. But in the meantime, probably like she is not as prominent as other probably scholar, you know. Maybe because like she was based in Ireland, not in North American. Or you know, we are in market. The market probably certainly not perfect. But my perception is like, you know, I agree with what many people have said. You know, eventually good papers will win out, but the market is certainly not perfect. So, so thanks for listening to my rants. You know, I want to learn your perspective about how to sort of like, you know, you tell us what we can do individually, but certainly, you know, there's a lot of things out there. So, thank you.
Well, yeah, and I mean, those are all good comments. I guess you just remind me of the value of perseverance in this field, and perseverance will pay off. You stick with your ideas, you come up with your ideas, you try to refine your ideas. The process can sometimes feel arbitrary and unfair, but I think I have this faith in the process, the review process, the whole scholarly enterprise, that it actually helps refine work. And like I say, I've been knocked down so many times, and most of us just don't like talking about all the times we got knocked down, because it's so much more fun to talk about your successes. But with rare exceptions, even the most successful people have had so many failures. And the question is, can you brush yourself off and learn from your failures so that the next thing you do is even better? And so that's all I'm going to say is perseverance is really important. I also want, maybe I for just a second, I've got this idea that one of my colleagues talks about being a blue-collar scholar. And what he's talking about is the idea of building good work habits and sticking to them. And I think this, and he does things like, when he says he's a blue-collar scholar, he says every day he writes for an hour, and that it's on his schedule. No interruptions. He just writes for an hour, and that may be revisions, that may be fresh work, but by creating that structure for himself, he creates that discipline. And I think if you took our 5 C's approach, you could also make that part of your blue-collar scholar idea. This is what I do for myself, by the way. I just take I just have an Excel file, a Word file set up like this, that it's blank, and I pull it up And when I have a new idea, I'll just start filling it in and try to see if I can fill in all the cells. And when I have when I'm working with a doctoral student, and they come to with an idea, I'll send them away with this worksheet and I'll say, okay, go fill it in. And to me, this is related to this blue collar scholar idea, which is that you have a structure and you kind of try to stick to it. Anyway, that's my only point, that creating these habits that you fall back on your habits. They allow you to brush yourself off when you have the failures so that you can just dig in again and do your hour of writing, to fill out your grid, just keep working at it. And that persistence generally does pay off.
Don, I'm just going to list a few people that are in line here.
Sure.
And, next, Venkataraman has a question, followed by Han Louis, and then Ellie. So, Venkataraman, would you like to come on and ask your question? Oh, and I see Katrina, maybe fourth there.
Yes, while I really appreciate the value of elegant and engaging writing, I think engaging writing is very important because that's how we can reach out to a wide audience. And one is always reminded of the greats like C. Wright Mills, who wrote The Sociological Imagination. But I think as we see in most organizational studies, in journals, I think the whole idea of this contribution, and even if you follow this grid, which is absolutely fantastic, but this whole thing boils down to the contribution. And even if you really want to say that you have something interesting to say, but you really need to say it in a complex way with a lot of diagrams, and sometimes, they're trying to explain it in a narrative style and with the best possible logical argument you have doesn't really work, and then they turn it back to you.
Agreed. And
What to do?
So one thing I think about when you said that was that thinking about your audience, because the people the people who are at the table are a very small group of people in the kind of scholarship you're talking about. It's a very small group that's your core audience. They're the people who are going to require you to have a very complicated and sophisticated explanation. But you've got a broader audience, which is the other people who are reading that journal, or the other people who are in management and business, or whatever the broader field is you're working toward. And you also want to write to them. And so if there's a way for you to have a simpler introduction and a more complicated body of the paper, that's just one idea for how you might thread that needle, where you start off with this exceptional level of clarity that even a novice to the area would understand. But then as you get into the paper, you develop that more in-depth and complicated explanation that's going to absolutely be necessary for you to satisfy the people who are actually in that discussion. And that's the best I can do without knowing any specifics. But that would be my recommendation.
And next we have Han Louis.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm very curious about that. How could we find out the appropriate methodology for our research? Because I think as a novice in these areas, sometimes we can find problems, or we can spot and phenomena in the real world, and we develop our interest, and we also read a lot of papers to find the logic, or to find out the rationale of the authors, to try to find some inspiration from those articles. But for me, I think it's very difficult to find a really rightful or and really appropriate tools for us to research.
So are you talking about tools or ideas or?
Methodologies for us to, if we want to explore one phenomenon or problems. I think as a novice in these areas, it's very difficult to find out the appropriate tool.
Yeah, that's not an easy question for me to answer, because my observation is that you learned certain tools early on in your career, and then those are the tools you apply to the problems that you find. Like if you're a qualitative researcher, which I'm not, then the ideas that come to you are the ones that you're going to look at with qualitative methods. And if you're a formal modeler, then you're going to apply formal theory. And if you're an archival researcher, you're going to apply archival research. And so and this isn't satisfactory, because it could be, basically you use the tool you have, and rather than the best tool for the job. And I think that's just the nature of it, because there's so many tools and you have to be expert in them, that it's very hard for you to learn a completely new tool set in order to just solve the next problem. This is where grafting comes in handy, because if you find out that the idea you came up with seems to lend itself perfectly to qualitative research, but you're not a qualitative research, well, then you might bring on a qualitative research onto your project team, so that they can help you with the empirical methodology. So I know that's not a completely satisfactory answer, especially for a new person, but one way I might approach it is by, when you're doing a lot of reading, you're going to find out that certain kinds of methodologies appeal to the kinds of questions you're interested in. And those are the methodologies then that you probably want to become expert in, and you probably want to really be, that'll be your toolkit. So that's my best advice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, next we have Ellie, and then followed by Katharina, Narsrin, Michael, and Malika. Ellie, would you like to ask your question? Ellie, I'm not sure if you're still there, or perhaps you're muted, but we can come back to you. Katharina, would you like to ask your question?
I'm sorry, I'm still here. It just happened something with my clicking the unmute. Can I say?
Yes, please. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. It took, for some reason, it was blocked. Anyway, my question is regarding style connection with journal. We decide to submit. Like, for example, we have a monograph, like a dissertation, which is a monograph, and we are trying different topics and searching different journals. And then once you find some connection with one journal, you decide for that. But what is a good amount of, I mean, I know it's not a matter of quantity, it's quality, of course, but I mean, how many articles are enough to connect, to include published from this journal? And then do we really have to follow the style of the journal to make our article look like that? Like, for example, before you said a short introduction is better, but some journals, I can see from journal analysis that they have long introductions. So in this case, yeah, any tips regarding that?
Yeah, and you're right. When I give that advice about short introductions, I'm thinking about particular journals that I tend to write for. And you're making a really good point, which is that
yes, thank you.
You need to actually understand the journal you're writing for. I think of it as different journals have different cultures, even that you have to. You're going to seem like this actually is relevant to the 5 C's, because when you're thinking about common ground, one of the things that you want to signal when you're joining, when you're establishing that common ground, is that you are a legitimate part of the conversation, and you will signal that you're an outsider if you're not following the local culture, the local norms. So you're right. If a long introduction is standard and the norm in a particular journal, and I come in with my 3-paragraph introduction, then I'm going to signal right away that I'm an outsider. Or if I do something that is just not done in that journal, I'm not so, for myself, I almost never worry about if I'm citing articles from that journal. Chances are I am, but not heavily. And so I don't worry about that so much, but I do worry about the idea that my submission feels like the submissions that I've read a lot of in that journal. So I think it's important that you open that journal and that you read recent articles and you say, okay, does the style of my writing, is it, even the audience that I'm targeting, does it feel like it's matching this journal? And that's why usually it's not a great idea to take a rejection from the first journal and just simply send it to the next journal. You really should make sure, like you say, that you understand what the expectations are at that next journal, and of course this means reformatting the reference section, because they all have different expectations for how references are formatted. But more than that, that you make sure that the style and the feel of it and the tone of it, and it matches the culture of that, and you will at least avoid signaling that you're not part of the group, that you're an out-group member. So that can be dangerous if they feel like, wait a second, have you ever even read this journal? That's a kind of, as a reviewer, sometimes you feel that way. It's like, have you ever even read this journal? Do you know? You obviously don't know who you're writing to, and you want to avoid that reaction.
Yes, thank you. And how many articles from the journal do you need to include? Because I think this is important. I mean, other people say it's important, so I don't know how important it is, of course.
So, I mean, I've been an editor, and I never, ever cared how much they cited that particular journal. So, and I know this differs from journal to journal, but I think that it's the least important consideration. More important is, are you covering the conversation? So if you're doing a good job of establishing the common ground, then if the part of the conversation that you have to cover is coming out of that journal, then yeah, you need to cite that journal. But so that would be my guidelines for success.
So you mean any conversation could be suitable, not just a conversation that interests this journal, because also the conversation should be fitted to the journal, I think. That's
correct. Yeah, and that would help you determine whether or not this is even the journal you want to try to approach, because and they might even reject you if it turns out that you're trying to, if they say, well, wait a second, this is something we never deal with in this journal. You might want another journal.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Billy and Dawn. Katrina?
Yes, I wanted to ask actually 2 questions from you, Dawn. So what are your personal writing habits? The first one, and the second one, basically, how do you keep on working with several papers to progress well? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm not, unlike my colleague, I'm not quite as good a blue-collar scholar, which means I don't set aside time every day to write, but I do admire people who do that. We have a woman in our business school. We have a women's writing group where, which I think is pretty interesting. The people who have very busy lives and families and all sorts of demands on themselves set aside, I think, 2 hours a week where they all get together in a conference room and they open up their computers, and the idea is that you're not supposed to talk to each other. You're just supposed to sit there and write. So they hold each other accountable for setting aside time where they all write, but it's a regular part of their schedule, so that they're not allowed to schedule other things during that time. It forces them to create time every week, and I think that's brilliant. I would like to do something like that myself, but I don't. But so as far as my own style, what I do is I do follow my 5 C's, and sometimes I'll get asked to join a project that's already underway, and I will actually take out my 5 C's, and I will try to see what's going on in that project and whether I can fill them all out. And then I'll share it with the other co-authors, and I'll ask them for their opinions. And so I'm always going back to this 5 C's model and making sure if any of them is weak, the whole paper is weak. That's the problem with that's the beauty and the problem with the 5 C's, is that if any of the C's is weak, the whole paper is weak. And so I really live by that. Now, in terms of multiple projects, I think my only advice is, as I've learned over my career, is that I start to get a strong feeling when a project isn't really going to be successful, when it's not going anywhere. And early on in my career, I was hesitant to let those projects go. Later on in my career, I'm much more comfortable with saying I've got to focus on the ones that seem to have more possibilities for success. So I try to limit the number of projects that I have going at any one time. And when I mean limit, I'm going to say maybe around 5 at any one time. And you start getting any more than that, it gets to be too cognitively complex. And having that many allows for some things to fail, some things for you to drop, some things to, start to look really promising, and you put more energy into them. And so that's my style. But that's also not a universal recommendation, because I have colleagues who really try to keep it to like 3 projects, and I have others who seem to have like 15 going at the same time and can handle it. So there's no universal answer to that. It's based on your own what you're comfortable with and what you can do.
Thank you, Nasrin, and then Michael.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lange, for writing this insightful paper. When I read your paper, these building blocks really helped me to build my paper.
Oh, good.
I understand that the concern gives some idea to write the contribution. And my question is, how do we balance the concern, contribution, and the scope of the journal? And this goes back somewhat to the Eddie's question, because sometimes I understand in my course that the editor will not send the paper to review if there is no value. And sometimes reviewers says that this paper doesn't have enough contribution, or it doesn't go with the flow of the paper because there's not enough paper cited from those particular journal, even if the scope matches directly.
Yeah. I still think that if you've done a really good job of establishing the common ground, and you've covered the parts of the conversation that you need to cover, that it's not a fair criticism from a reviewer or from an editor to say you need to cite more from this journal. I just don't agree with that criticism. I would find that bothersome, because however, if they said it's something like, this part of the conversation you seem to have missed, and it turns out that was an article from that journal, then that's on me, because I should have included it because it was part of the common ground. And then if they say, if a criticism I get from the review team is that, okay, it's all fine, but you haven't really influenced the discussion. In other words, you haven't really made the case that you made a contribution, then I'm going to have to figure out why that happened. Was it because I didn't explain it well enough, or are they correct that I just didn't find a complication that I could then argue was a contribution? So my short answer to your question is, I'm just not as bothered by journals that would want me to cite more in their journal, unless it was related to one of these C's. Then I'll listen very carefully. But if they're just saying, we just need more cites from our journal, then that is not legitimate to me.
But the problem is we cannot really do about that when the reviewer sees and the paper is already rejected. And
yeah.
I would just say that maybe you or the senior scholars could do something for like the review guidelines, because I saw reviews that is directly opposite one to other. Even when I reviewed for some papers, some journals, I saw that when I'm saying something else, the another reviewer is saying something totally different. And it also happened in my paper, because the two reviewers are saying totally opposite things. So
This will
really
happen.
frustrating.
Yeah, this will definitely happen. It's frustrating. This is where a good editor can be very helpful. And if the editor should help you distinguish, especially if it's not a rejection, if it's an R&R, the editor should help you, guide you to which of those reviewers, especially if they're contradicting each other, which one to pay attention to. But I've also had the experience where reviewers don't agree with each other, and this is the part of, going back to the fact that we're all humans, and that we're all not perfect, and we're all not correct all the time, and so you're going to have people who have different opinions on things, and sometimes I take that as my own failure, because I think if two reviewers came up with such different opinions on like what I should do or what the problem is, that maybe I wasn't clear enough, that I gave them an opening to disagree, and so I didn't establish the common ground well enough, and I didn't make a case for the complication well enough, and then all I did is I introduced this big controversy that reviewers could come in and give their own opinions on. So, but I also understand that review process can be frustrating, and it's not perfect. It's imperfect. And sometimes you've got to take your hit and like I say, brush yourself off and go to the next journal.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Michael.
much.
Thanks, Don. This is a great presentation of the 5 C's. Really appreciate it. My question is sort of like more of a broader question, in that let's say somebody is not looking to get tenure, or they have tenure, and you want to give them advice in writing, and using your approach, is wonderful. So let's say you shoot for an A journal, you get a review that's negative. You don't think you're ever going to be able to hit it. You're not going to be able to revise it. Do you ever suggest students to go for a B journal and maybe even a C journal? Because, publishing your work is sort of a feeling of getting the word out, getting yourself out there, putting your school on the map. So, you're showing that you have a research stream. You could always go back and try another angle, but I wanted to get your take on that. And maybe, for the people that are in the audience, maybe you can give them some advice along with me.
Yeah. I like the question, because it's actually something I think about, and having some projects that seem to have been rejected at all sort of the top outlets, what the so-called A journals, and then what do you do with it? Do you move on? Do you move to another tier of journals? And I think it depends what your goal is. And if your goal is to get what you think is a pretty interesting idea actually out there, then I highly recommend that you persevere and that you go to the next journal. If it's a B journal, go for it, because there are really great examples in our field where people got knocked down at the top journals, persevered, got their work into a lower tier journal, and that work has been influential and cited, and so that, I think, it is one goal that you should keep in mind. If the goal is simply to get one more publication on your curriculum vitae, then I'm not so enthused about it, because if it's not an idea that you think is that great, and here's why: because that next journal is going to be as much work as an A journal. The reviewers are going to give you a hard time. You're going to be struggling with it. And it's just going to feel frustrating if it's not an idea you love and that you think actually has to get out there. So I guess it depends upon where your goal is. If your goal is to get a good idea out there, then keep at it. Keep at it because every good idea will find a home eventually. And I would love to see your idea wherever it appears. And I don't cite articles based on the tier of journal they're in. I cite them on how good of an idea they are. And I think most people do, which means that if your good idea appears in a lesser journal, it'll get cited, it'll get noticed, it'll influence the discussion. If it's a trivial idea that finally gets into a B journal and it makes no impact, then my question is kind of, especially when you're describing somebody who's already got tenure or doesn't care about tenure, that's not really part of it, then why is what I would say.
Right. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Dawn, we have 4 more questions.
Okay.
Malika, Jennifer, Sunitha, and Mukesh. It's about 10 to the hour, so I also wanted to check in with you.
Yeah, should we try to wrap up at the hour?
Okay, Malika, your question?
Thank you, Don, for such an interesting presentation. So the question I have is about writing the introduction. And I see sometimes, scholars, start with a little story, or a phenomenon at the beginning of the paper. And I'm struggling right now to figure out whether I should do it for one of my manuscripts that I'm about to submit. So my question is, when is that, a good way of writing a paper? What are the conditions that, when reviewers appreciate that, okay, this is a good way that I can relate to it?
I like to do that if I can. I have done it in papers, and it especially works for an empirical paper, I think, because I do a lot of theory papers, which it doesn't work so well for, although I have done it in theory papers, but sometimes introducing the context right away in empirical paper and sort of a story about it can be a great way of drawing the reader in. But this is another example where there's just no universal answer to your question. It kind of depends upon what you're doing. I do like this for presentations when you're presenting this paper to an audience at a conference or at university or wherever, that you start with a story, really draws your audience in and makes you feel like it's not just you're not just looking at this as an academic, but you have a real interest in it. And it kind of brings the audience into the level of interest that you have in it by telling a story. So sometimes that works for writing, not always. And it's a case-by-case basis. That's all.
Thank you. Jennifer, your question?
Yes, Don, you've talked a bit about how as new scholars and new writers, we haven't necessarily fine-tuned our radar on like what's good and what's bad. So yes. I was wondering if you had any advice, whether we are too big for our britches or are more along the lines of not having faith in our own work, but developing that intuition of, okay, I wrote this paper and this paper is good enough to try to get published.
What I found really helpful, Jennifer, when I was first starting out, is running my work past people who did have that experience. And I just have very strong memories of, like, one time I shared it with one of my professors and she said, yeah, no, you might want to just put this on the shelf. And then I shared another work with one of the professors and he said, this is one of the best things I've read recently. You need to submit this. So and both of them felt the same to me. Both of those works felt like they were equally good. And yet getting somebody else's opinion on it who really knew what they were talking about really helped me refine that intuition that you're talking about. And now I feel like I've got a better sense of it, but in the beginning you don't. And so, and just as a general, and an extension of that as a general rule is, before you submit to a journal, you should always have somebody locally, what they call a friendly reviewer, look at your work and give you feedback on it, and try to find a friendly reviewer who's not friendly, who will actually be as mean to you as a reviewer will be. and we'll try to help you find the holes. Those are the people that, and then do the same thing for them. Have these relationships that you retain in your career, where you can share work with each other, and you can be really open with each other about where you think the weaknesses are, and that those kinds of relationships are so helpful. As an editor, I often would read a submission and I would say, it's clear that they never showed this to anybody. And then some of the advice I would give people is, please, before you submit, show it to somebody and get feedback, because you only have one shot at journal submission. And if you get rejected, most journals won't let you resubmit there. So it's better to try to refine it as much as you can before you submit.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sunitha?
Thank you. Professor, I was just curious to know, how do you balance the reading and the writing part of it? Should one keep a separate time for reading, or when we set a writing time, does it also include time for reading?
So I want, this is the kind of person I want to be. My aspiration is to be the kind of person who reads and doesn't write anything until I feel really comfortable, except for maybe a few notes. And I feel like once you start writing, then you've got this problem I talked about before, which is that you fall in love with your writing. And I think it's better if you can forestall the actual I'm not talking about note-taking now, because note-taking is part of reading, but I'm talking about actually writing sentences and paragraphs. And the danger is that when you do that, you stop you stop digging into the literature, you stop that in-depth look. And so my aspiration is to be the kind of person who reads, and then feels like, okay, now I'm ready. Now I understand the conversation. Now I feel like I've got a complication to explore, and then I start writing my sentences and my paragraphs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, because when everybody says, we set apart certain time for writing, 2 hours in the morning or 3 hours in the morning, then that's where the question comes. I think for your style, this works well. Yeah.
And then with that, and if you're a person who sets aside time every day, then the idea is you've got more than one project going, and so the one you're writing on is one you've already done that in-depth work on. And others you're still doing the reading part of. So ideally, you've also set some time aside for doing more reading. I also, as a new scholar, this is kind of a nice little framework for taking notes on papers that you're reading. If you can make a quick note in each of these cells on a paper and then file it away, so that when you want to remember what so-and-so said, when you want to remember what Barney 2018 said, well, you can just quickly pull up your little note sheet here, and you've got the 5 C's. That's why I said it's a good tool for reading and remembering as well, especially when you're new in the field.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, we have Mukesh.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Hi, Mukesh.
Yeah. Thank you, Don. I have a question that we often face, this so what question, especially in contribution section and generally in the paper as well. So how do you think, what is your approach for answering those so what questions in all those sections?
Yeah, I mean, so what, of course, really comes in our model in the concern where you're trying to establish why the complication, the puzzle of the twist you found in the literature or in the conversation, why that matters. And yes, people will say, so what? And you should ask yourself, so what? That should be the primary question you ask yourself while you're building your 5 C's. It's so what? And anticipate that the reviewer is going to ask it even more harshly than you just asked yourself. And all I'm going to say is that the whole 5C model is, if there's one question that it's devoted to, it's so what. If you've established a strong common ground and found the complication in it, that's part of so what. then concern is you telling what that so what is, and then the contribution, of course, is then telling people that look at how I took you to this place, and so that's also so what. So there's no easy universal answer to your question, Mukesh, other than saying that this is really what this model is directed at, is trying to forestall that so what question. And even as best, this isn't, by the way, a magical solution. It's just a systematic way of trying to approach that, establishing that you've dealt with that so what question. And I can tell you, as much as this is a model that I am dedicated to and use all the time, I still get journal rejections that are basically so what. And so it's not, like I say, this isn't a magical solution. It's just a systematic way of trying to get closer to establishing that you've addressed the so what question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.